Nobody in the emergency department understood why the old veteran stopped. Struggling the moment, he looked into the quiet nurse's eyes. The ambulance doors had barely opened before the elderly man grabbed the sleeve of a paramedic and whispered through shallow breaths, "Find the nurse." "We got several nurses," the paramedic replied while guiding the stretcher inside. The veteran slowly lifted a trembling hand and pointed across the busy emergency room. Her, the nurse he was pointing at, almost disappeared into the crowd. She wore plain navy scrubs, her dark hair tied neatly behind her head, and comfortable shoes that had seen far too many 12-hour shifts. Her name badge read, Leora Vance, RN. No one looked twice at her. Most people in the hospital knew Leora as a nurse who volunteered for extra shifts, skipped lunch when the department became busy, and somehow remembered every patient's favorite blanket or preferred cup of water. She never raised her voice. She never bragged. She simply kept moving. Some of her co-workers appreciated her. Others barely noticed she was there. Room 6 needs blood work. Room 9 is waiting. Can somebody restock the trauma cart? The requests flew through the department from every direction. Leora answered each one with the same calm voice. "I've got it. I'll take care of it." "No problem." A younger nurse rushed past her carrying paperwork. "Leora, can you cover my patient for 5 minutes?" "Of course." It was always of course. No complaints. No attention. Just work. The emergency department rarely slowed down. Phones rang. Monitors beeped. Families asked questions. Stretchers rolled across polished floors. In the middle of all the noise, Leora noticed something almost everyone else missed. A little girl sitting beside her injured father had been quietly crying for nearly 10 minutes. Nobody had ignored her on purpose. They were simply overwhelmed. Without saying a word, Leora knelt beside the child. "Would you like to help me with something important?" The little girl sniffled. "What?" "I need someone brave enough to hold this extra bandage for me." The child nodded immediately. Within seconds, her tears stopped. Her father smiled despite the pain in his shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered. Leora smiled back before moving on to the next patient. One of the senior physicians watched the interaction from across the room. "She's good with people," he admitted quietly. Another doctor shrugged. "She's dependable." Then he returned to reading lab results. Dependable. That was usually the biggest compliment Leora ever received. Minutes later, another ambulance radioed ahead. Elderly male, difficulty breathing, unstable oxygen, possible cardiac complications. The trauma bay prepared quickly. The stretcher rolled through the doors. The same veteran who had pointed toward Leora now fought for every breath. His weathered face was pale. His hands shook. Several nurses immediately connected monitors, while physicians asked questions. When did this start? Any allergies? What medications does he take? The veteran struggled to answer. His breathing became faster. One doctor glanced at the monitor. Probably heart failure. Another suggested pneumonia. A respiratory therapist prepared oxygen. Leora stepped beside the bed without rushing. She looked at the man's hands, his neck, his breathing pattern, then his old military bracelet. For just a second, something changed in her expression. Not fear, recognition. She leaned closer. "Sir, can you hear me?" The veteran slowly nodded. "Were you ever exposed to heavy smoke during deployment?" His eyes suddenly focused on her. He nodded again. Leora continued asking calm, specific questions. "Did this happen before?" Another weak nod. "After long travel?" A third nod. The attending physician looked puzzled. "Leora?" She answered without taking her eyes off the patient. "I think we're looking at the wrong problem." The room became quiet. Everyone respected her enough to listen, even if they didn't understand. She pointed toward the monitor. "His breathing doesn't match what we're assuming." The physician folded his arms. "What are you thinking?" Leora spoke carefully. "There are signs that don't fit heart failure alone." She listed several observations. His skin color, his breathing rhythm, his reaction to certain movements. Small details almost invisible beneath the chaos. The physician looked back at the patient, then back at Leora. "Let's run another assessment." Nobody argued. Within minutes, Additional tests confirmed exactly what Leora had suspected. The treatment plan changed immediately. Medication was adjusted. The respiratory therapist changed approach. Gradually, the veteran's breathing became steadier. His shoulders relaxed. Color slowly returned to his face. Several staff members exchanged surprised looks. The attending physician quietly exhaled. Good catch. Leora simply nodded. She wasn't waiting for praise. She was already updating the patient's chart. Nearly 20 minutes later, the veteran was breathing comfortably enough to speak. He looked around until he found Leora standing nearby, checking another patient's for a line. "Ma'am." She walked over. "How are you feeling?" "Better. I'm glad." He studied her face for several long seconds. Then he asked something nobody expected. "Where did you learn to recognize that?" The nearby nurses looked up. The physician paused while reading the chart. Leora remained perfectly still. "I've had unusual experiences." The veteran gave a slow smile. "No." His voice had grown stronger. "You didn't guess." She said nothing. "You knew." Silence settled over the room. The veteran continued watching her with growing certainty. There aren't many people outside military medicine who would ask those questions. One of the younger nurses looked confused. "Military medicine?" The veteran ignored everyone else. His eyes never left Leora. "You've treated this before." Leora offered only a small smile. "The important thing is that you're recovering." She adjusted his blanket. "You should rest." As she turned to leave, the veteran quietly reached for her wrist. His grip was gentle. "I've met people like you." She stopped. "They don't forget." For the first time that entire shift, something flickered across Leora's face. Not surprise, not fear, a memory. It disappeared almost instantly. She gently freed her hand. "Get some sleep?" Then she walked away before anyone could ask another question. The younger nurses immediately gathered near the station. "What was that about?" "I've never heard Leora talk like that." "Did you see how fast she figured it out?" One physician looked toward the hallway, where Leora had already disappeared into another patient room. "I've worked with her for 3 years," he said quietly. "I suddenly realized." He stopped. "What?" "I don't actually know anything about her." Across the room, the elderly veteran watched Leora disappear around the corner. He shook his head slowly. Then, almost to himself, he whispered words that sent a chill through the nurse standing beside him. "That woman has seen war." The nurse stared toward the hallway, and for the first time, everyone in the emergency department began wondering who Leora Vance really was. By the end of the week, something unusual was happening in the emergency department, and nobody could explain it. Whenever a veteran walked through the hospital doors, someone eventually asked the same question: "Is Nurse Leora working today?" The front desk volunteers noticed it first, then the triage nurses. Soon even the security guards exchanged puzzled looks. One retired Marine with a sprained ankle smiled when he heard she was on duty. "I'll wait," he said. The receptionist looked confused. "You don't need to. Another nurse is available right now." He shook his head politely. "I'd rather wait for her." He wasn't the only one. A former Air Force mechanic requested Leora after arriving with chest pain. A retired Army engineer asked whether the quiet nurse was working before agreeing to be admitted. None of them knew each other. At least, that was what everyone assumed. Leora treated each of them exactly the same way she treated every patient, with patience, respect, and steady hands. She never acted surprised. She never asked questions about their military service unless it directly related to their care. And she certainly never hinted that she recognized any of them. The mystery only grew. During lunch break, 2 younger nurses sat together in the staff room. "I don't get it," one whispered. "They all trust her immediately." The other shrugged. "Maybe she's just really kind." "No," the first replied. "There's something else." Before either of them could guess again, Leora walked into the room carrying a cup of coffee. The conversation stopped instantly. She smiled. "You two don't have to go quiet because I walked in. We weren't talking about anything important." One nurse answered too quickly. Leora simply nodded. She had heard that answer before. She sat alone near the window, quietly reading through patient education materials while eating a simple sandwich. Her break lasted exactly 12 minutes. Then her pager sounded. She stood without finishing her coffee. Back to work. The afternoon remained steady until the emergency radio interrupted everything. Multiple vehicle collision. 6 incoming patients. 2 critical. Arrival in 4 minutes. Every conversation ended. The emergency department came alive. Stretchers were prepared. Medical supplies were checked. Extra staff hurried into trauma rooms. Leora moved without hesitation. She checked oxygen tanks. Prepared for supplies. Verified medications. Nothing about her movements seemed rushed. Yet she accomplished twice as much as anyone expected. The ambulance doors burst open. Paramedics rolled patients inside one after another. A teenager with a broken arm. An elderly woman struggling to breathe. A delivery driver with serious injuries to his leg. 2 frightened passengers covered in dust and broken glass. Voices filled every corner. We need another monitor. Where's respiratory? CT is ready. For a brief moment, the department felt dangerously close to losing control. Then Leora spoke. Room 4 is stable enough to move. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Send respiratory to room 2 first. She turned toward another nurse. Keep his family updated every 10 minutes. Without looking away from the patient in front of her, she added, Someone call radiology and tell them we're sending 2 together. People simply followed her instructions, not because she was in charge, because every instruction made sense. The attending physician noticed it almost immediately. Instead of chaos, the department found a rhythm. Patients moved where they needed to go. Equipment arrived before anyone had to ask twice. Families received updates before frustration turned into panic. Within half an hour, the worst of the emergency had passed. The physician removed his gloves and looked around. Leora. She looked up while documenting medications. Yes, doctor? Come with me for a second. She followed him into the quieter hallway outside the trauma rooms. He folded his arms. I've been doing emergency medicine for 22 years. She waited. I've worked disasters. Still she said nothing. But I've never seen someone organize a room the way you just did. Leora looked toward the busy department. They were already doing the hard work. You knew exactly what everyone needed before they asked. She offered a small smile. Experience helps. The physician studied her carefully. What kind of experience? There was again the question she never answered directly. Leora looked through the hallway window at nurses helping patients. I've worked in places where staying calm mattered. The physician laughed softly. That's the most mysterious answer I've heard all year. She smiled politely. I should get back. Before he could ask another question, she returned to the emergency department. Later that evening, another patient arrived. A retired soldier in his late 70s walked slowly with a cane. He smiled as soon as he saw Leora. There you are. She helped him into an examination room. It's good to see you. The older man chuckled. I was hoping you'd be here. As she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm, his eyes drifted to a thin scar running along the inside of her left forearm. It was only visible because she had rolled her sleeve slightly above her wrist. His smile faded. He stared silently. Leora noticed. Everything okay? Instead of answering, the man gently pointed toward the scar. You got that overseas. She paused for barely a heartbeat. It's an old injury. He continued studying it. Not many people come home with one like that. She finished checking his pulse. It healed. The veteran lowered his voice. So did mine. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, he smiled again, but there was something different in his expression now. Respect. The kind shared between people who understood more than they said aloud. As Leora finished the examination, he quietly asked, Do they know? She looked toward the hallway where nurses laughed while restocking supplies. They know I'm an ER nurse. That's not what I meant. She gently placed his chart at the end of the bed. The past belongs in the past. He nodded slowly. Maybe. After she left the room, the veteran remained seated for a long moment. Another patient waiting nearby recognized the military cap he wore. "Were you in the service?" "I was." He glanced toward the hallway, where Leora disappeared around a corner. "So was she." The waiting patient looked surprised. "The nurse?" The veteran smiled to himself. "More than you'll ever guess." Across the nurse's station, one of the clerks looked up from the appointment schedule. Something had caught her attention. 3 different veterans had requested Leora that day. None of them knew each other, yet every one of them had looked at her with the same quiet recognition. And as another former service member walked through the emergency room doors, scanning the room until his eyes found Leora, it became impossible to ignore one unsettling question. Who had she been before she ever became Nurse Leora Vance? The explosion happened just after sunrise, and within minutes, every ambulance in the county seemed to be heading toward the hospital. The emergency department had barely finished changing shifts when the first radio call came through. "Industrial accident at the Riverside manufacturing plant. Multiple injuries. Prepare for mass casualty intake." The charge nurse looked around the room. Everyone stations now. The calm atmosphere vanished. Extra beds were rolled into hallways. Supplies were stacked outside trauma rooms. The waiting area was cleared to make space for incoming families. Leora quietly tied her hair back one more time and checked the emergency carts herself. A young nurse beside her took a deep breath. "I've never been through something like this." Leora handed her a pair of gloves. "You already know what to do." "What if I forget?" "You won't." The younger nurse searched Leora's face. "How can you be so sure?" "Because you'll focus on the person in front of you." The answer was simple. It was enough. The ambulance doors opened. Patients arrived one after another. Some walked inside with assistants. Others came on stretchers. The emergency department filled faster than anyone expected. Doctors called out requests. Nurses rushed between rooms. Families gathered outside, desperate for news. For the first several minutes, the system held together. Then everything changed. One of the hospital's internal communication screens suddenly went dark. A technical problem spread through the department. Electronic patient tracking stopped updating. The digital board that assigned treatment rooms froze. Someone frowned at the monitor. "It's not responding." Another staff member tried refreshing it. Nothing. The charge nurse looked frustrated. "We can't wait for IT." Without the tracking system, confusion started building. A transporter entered the wrong room. Lab samples almost followed the wrong patients. People began calling out names across the department. Leora looked around once. Only once. Then she walked to the supply cabinet, grabbed a thick black marker and several blank patient tags. She taped a large sheet of paper to the wall. Across the top, she wrote 4 simple columns. Immediate, urgent, delayed, ready for discharge. She clipped handwritten patient cards beneath each heading. Then she turned to the staff. "If you move a patient, move the card." Nobody questioned her. Within moments, another nurse copied the idea onto a portable whiteboard. Someone else began writing room numbers. A physician looked over and nodded. "Good. Keep going." The confusion began to settle. The handwritten system wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. Everyone could see it. Everyone understood it. A respiratory therapist smiled as he updated one of the cards. "This is actually faster." Leora simply moved to the next patient. She checked dressings, adjusted medications, comforted frightened families. The emergency department found its rhythm again. Hours passed before anyone had a chance to breathe. The hospital cafeteria sent sandwiches. Volunteers handed out bottled water. Several community members arrived to donate blood. Among them were older men and women wearing jackets with military patches stitched across the shoulders. They waited quietly in line. One gray-haired veteran happened to glance through the emergency room doors. His eyes stopped on Leora. He watched her for several seconds. Then his expression changed. He nudged a veteran standing beside him. "Look." The second man followed his gaze. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, the second veteran whispered, "No." The first nodded slowly. "I think it is." The second veteran frowned. "Here, in this hospital." Before long, they were seated in the donation area, still watching through the glass whenever Leora crossed the hallway. One volunteer noticed. Do you know that nurse? The older man smiled. I might. You don't sound sure. It's been a long time. He looked back toward the emergency department. People change. His friend quietly added, not their eyes. Later that afternoon, Leora stepped into the break room to grab another bottle of water. She had barely taken one sip when someone knocked gently on the open door. It was one of the veterans from the donation center. He stood respectfully. Excuse me. She recognized him immediately. So it really is you. Leora remained calm. It's good to see you. He smiled with quiet relief. I wasn't certain. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he chuckled softly. I never thought I'd find you working in an ER. I like helping people. You always did. She looked toward the hallway. I should get back. Before she could leave, he spoke again. I still remember what everyone used to call you. Her eyes met his. A silent warning. He understood it immediately. His voice became almost a whisper. I won't say it. She nodded gratefully. Thank you. He smiled. Some names belong to another life. She walked out of the room without another word. The veteran remained standing there, remembering a younger medic who had refused to leave injured people behind no matter how dangerous things became. Across the hallway, two nurses had noticed the conversation. Did you hear that? One whispered. He definitely knew her. The other nodded. But from where? Neither had an answer. Late that evening, after the last emergency patient had been stabilized, the hospital director arrived for an update. He listened carefully as department leaders reviewed the day's response. One physician pointed toward the handwritten board still hanging on the wall. That probably saved us hours. The director studied it. Whose idea was this? Several people answered at once. Leora's. The director looked surprised. The nurse? Yes. He nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to review her personnel file. The request seemed harmless. Routine, even. An administrator opened the hospital records. Education, licenses, employment history, excellent performance reviews, volunteer work. Everything appeared normal, almost too normal. The director frowned. Is this complete? The administrator checked again. As far as I can tell. He looked closer. There are several years before nursing school with almost no employment history. No explanation? None. The director leaned back in his chair. Interesting. Across the hospital, Leora finished documenting her final patient of the shift. She removed her badge at night and quietly headed toward the employee exit. She never noticed the elderly veteran waiting outside beneath the fading evening light. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, he stood and smiled. You haven't changed. Leora stopped. He reached into his jacket and carefully pulled out a small, worn military challenge coin. Without saying another word, he held it out toward her. She stared at it. Her expression softened in a way no one at the hospital had ever seen. Just before she could respond, the hospital doors opened behind her, and the director stepped outside. He saw the coin. He saw the look on Leora's face. And in that silent moment, he realized the quiet nurse's past was far bigger than anyone inside the hospital had imagined. The hospital director could not forget what he had seen in the parking lot. The small challenge coin had looked old, worn smooth around the edges from years of being carried in someone's pocket. Whatever it meant, Leora had recognized it immediately. The next morning, he asked her to stop by his office before her shift. She knocked lightly on the open door. You want to see me? He stood from behind his desk. Please, come in. The office was quiet, a sharp contrast to the constant noise of the emergency department. He motioned toward the chair. You've done outstanding work here. Thank you. I've also noticed something unusual. Leora waited. Veterans seem to know you. She offered a polite smile but said nothing. He continued carefully. Yesterday I saw someone give you a military challenge coin. For the first time in the conversation, her eyes dropped toward the floor. I did. Would you mind telling me why? Several seconds passed. Finally she looked back up. I served before I became a nurse. The director nodded slowly. I guess as much. I was a combat medic. The room fell silent. He had expected military service. He had not expected those words. That explains your medical knowledge. Some of it. He folded his hands. Your records don't mention it. They weren't required to. No, he agreed. They weren't. He hesitated before asking his next question. Why keep it secret? Leora looked out the office window toward the ambulance entrance. Because I came here to be an emergency nurse. You already were one. She smiled faintly. No, I came here to become one. The director understood there was a difference. What happened? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the challenge coin resting on his desk. The veteran had left it with the receptionist that morning along with a short note asking that it be returned to her. Her thumb traced the worn engraving. There were people I couldn't save. The words came quietly. I know every medic carries that. Maybe, but knowing it doesn't make it easier. The director didn't interrupt. There was one rescue, she continued. Everything went wrong. Weather, communication, timing. She paused. We brought home as many as we could. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes carried memories she never described in detail. I kept asking myself if one more decision could have changed the outcome. You blamed yourself. For a long time. She set the coin back on the desk. When my service ended, I didn't want anyone calling me a hero. So you started over. I became a civilian nurse. He nodded, and you've been saving people ever since. She smiled gently. That's enough for me. The director stood. I appreciate your honesty. She rose from the chair. I'd rather the staff not make a big story out of it. I understand. And please, she hesitated. I don't want special treatment. You won't get it. She thanked him and returned downstairs before the morning rush began. The director watched her leave. Some people spent years trying to impress others. Leora had spent years trying to disappear. By early afternoon, the emergency department was busy again. A child with a broken wrist laughed, while Leora helped him choose the color of his cast. An elderly woman squeezed her hand before being admitted upstairs. The shift felt almost ordinary. Then an administrative assistant hurried toward the director. You should see this. She handed him a printed email. Its subject line read, Request for a hospital visit. The message came from a veteran support organization. Several former service members wanted permission to visit the hospital later that week. Reason for visit, to thank one of your nurses. The director read it twice. Then a second message arrived, and another within hours. Veterans from different states had contacted the hospital. Some wanted to attend. Others simply wanted to send letters. One enclosed a photograph taken years earlier. The faces were younger, covered in dust, standing beside an armored vehicle. One figure near the center wore medical gear instead of combat equipment. The face was partly hidden beneath protective glasses, but the director recognized the posture. Even in the old photograph, it was Leora. He quietly placed the picture back into the envelope. She had never told anyone, not because she was ashamed, because she wanted her work today to matter more than her past. While those messages continued arriving, another ambulance pulled into the emergency entrance. Incoming trauma patient, the paramedic radioed. Middle-aged male, severe injuries from a construction accident, blood, pressure dropping. The trauma team prepared immediately. Leora met the stretcher as it rolled through the doors. The patient was unconscious. Dust covered his work clothes. One side of his face was bruised. The physicians began their assessment. Let's move. For access. Monitor connected. Leora stepped to the patient's side. She checked his airway, adjusted his oxygen. Then she froze for the briefest moment. She looked closer. There was an old bracelet around his wrist. Not jewelry. A faded military survival band. Attached to it was a small metal tag. She recognized the engraving instantly. It wasn't just military issue. It belonged to a specific unit. Her breathing slowed. The attending physician glanced at her. Leora? She answered without taking her eyes off the patient. I'm here. But something inside her had shifted. She leaned closer. Years had changed the man's face. Gray hair had replaced black. New scars crossed the skin. Still, she knew him. Not from the hospital. Not from a photograph. From another place, another life. She quietly whispered a name that no one else in the room recognized. There was no response. The patient remained unconscious. The physician looked at her again. You know him? Leora hesitated, then nodded once. We served together. The room became completely still for a heartbeat. Nobody asked another question. There wasn't time. The patient's condition demanded every second. Leora pushed every personal memory aside. Her hands never stopped working. Her voice remained calm. Blood pressure? Coming up. Pulse. Improving. Prepare for imaging. The team moved as one. For the next hour, she stayed beside the stretcher until the patient was stable enough to leave for surgery. Only after the operating room doors closed did she finally step back. She leaned against the hallway wall for the first time anyone could remember. One of the younger nurses approached carefully. Are you okay? Leora looked toward the operating room. I don't know. The nurse had never seen her look uncertain before. Just then, the surgeon stepped out of the operating suite with a serious expression. He walked directly toward Leora. We've done everything we can. He paused before saying the words that made her heart stop. Now we wait. The first thing the former soldier saw when he opened his eyes was the same calm face he had trusted years before. The recovery room was quiet except for the soft rhythm of medical equipment. Morning sunlight slipped through the blinds, filling the room with a gentle glow. Leora was checking his chart when she noticed his eyes moving. She stepped closer. Can you hear me? He blinked slowly. After a few seconds, he managed the smallest nod. You've been through surgery, she said. Everything went well. Just take your time. He looked at her for several long moments, as if trying to place a memory that had been buried for years. Then his voice, rough from the breathing tube that had already been removed, barely formed a sentence. I knew you'd still be here. Leora smiled. You always were stubborn. A faint laugh escaped him before it turned into a cough. You said that 20 years ago. She handed him a small cup of water. And you still haven't listened. He took a careful sip. I thought I'd never see you again. So did I. Neither of them said anything for a while. There was no need. Some friendships survived without words. Later that afternoon, after the doctors confirmed he was stable, he asked if they could speak alone. Leora pulled a chair beside his bed. I owe you something, he said. You don't owe me anything. I do. He looked toward the window before continuing. Back then, everyone talked about medals. She remained silent, but the people who were really saving lives never cared about medals. He looked back at her. You carried people out when the rest of us thought it couldn't be done. She gently shook her head. We all did our jobs. He smiled. That's exactly what you'd say. Before she could answer, a nurse knocked on the door. Leora, the director asked if you could come downstairs when you have a minute. She nodded. I'll be there soon. The former soldier watched her leave. Some people change careers. Leora had simply changed uniforms. The next morning, the hospital entrance looked different. Several employees noticed unfamiliar faces gathering outside. Older men and women stood together in small groups. Some wore jackets with military unit patches. Others carried neatly folded letters. A few held framed photographs. The front desk receptionist counted them twice. Then she called the director. I think you should come downstairs. Within minutes, the lobby had quietly filled with veterans from different branches and different generations. None of them caused a disturbance. They simply waited. The director stepped into the lobby. Can I help you? An older woman stepped forward. We're here for Nurse Leora Vance. He smiled politely. May I ask why? She held out an envelope. To thank her. Then another veteran stepped forward. And this? He carried an old challenge coin inside a small display case. A third placed a handwritten journal on the reception desk. One after another, more veterans came forward. Every item carried a story. A photograph, a unit patch, a folded flag, a faded letter written decades earlier. None of them spoke loudly. There was no ceremony planned, only gratitude. The director looked around the lobby. I think she'd want to hear this herself. He asked someone to bring Leora downstairs. She arrived a few minutes later, still wearing her Navy scrubs and carrying a patient chart. She stopped as soon as the elevator doors opened. The lobby had gone completely quiet. More than 30 veterans stood facing her. For the first time in years, Leora looked completely speechless. One elderly veteran walked toward her. "You probably thought we'd forgotten." She slowly shook her head. "I never expected this." He smiled. "We didn't come because you're a combat medic." He pointed toward the emergency department behind her. "We came because you're still the same person." Another veteran stepped forward, holding a photograph. "You stayed with my brother until the rescue helicopter arrived." A woman in the back quietly wiped away tears. "You wrote my family after my husband couldn't." Someone else added softly, "You remembered every name." The former soldier from construction accident had been brought downstairs in a wheelchair with his doctor's permission. He rolled forward beside the others. "I wouldn't be here twice if it weren't for her." The hospital staff watched in complete silence. Many had worked beside Leora for years. Yet they were hearing these stories for the first time. The younger nurse who once asked how Leora stayed calm lowered her eyes. "I never knew. Neither had anyone else." The director stepped beside Leora. "I think everyone here would like to recognize what you've done." She gently shook her head. "I appreciate that. But if we're recognizing anyone..." She looked toward the emergency department. "Then recognize the people working in there." Several nurses glanced toward her. She continued, "The doctors, the technicians, the housekeeping staff, the paramedics, every person who shows up on difficult days." Her voice remained calm. "They save lives every single day." She paused. "And the people who never made a home from service deserve far more recognition than I ever will." The veterans nodded. None of them argued. They understood. The director looked around the room. "I think that's exactly why all of you came." A quiet round of applause began. Not loud, not dramatic, simply sincere. Several co-workers walked over one by one. The physician who had once called her dependable smiled. "I owe you an apology." "You don't. I judged you before I knew you." Leora smiled warmly. "You judged the nurse you worked with." And that was enough. The younger nurses laughed softly through tears. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in days. By the following week, life in the emergency department had returned to normal. Ambulances still arrived. Children still cried before getting stitches. Families still waited anxiously for updates. Leora moved through another busy shift exactly as she always had. She comforted frightened patients, helped nervous new nurses, stayed late to finish paperwork. Nothing about her routine had changed, only the way people saw her. Late that evening, as she walked past the hospital entrance, she noticed 3 veterans standing quietly across the street. They weren't waiting to speak with her. They simply raised their hands in a respectful salute. Leora paused. Then, with a gentle smile, she returned the salute. A moment later, another ambulance pulled into the emergency entrance. Without hesitation, she turned and walked back through the automatic doors. Someone inside needed help, just as they always had, and just as they always would.